The grandfather clock at the base of the stairs chimed 2 in the morning, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated through the sturdy oak timbers of the house. Eleanor Vance lay awake in the dark, her eyes tracing the familiar ornate patterns of the crown molding. She and her late husband, Thomas, had spent nearly a decade restoring this old Victorian, painstakingly stripping away years of neglect and rot to reveal the strong, unyielding wood beneath. It was a house built to weather storms, a sanctuary designed to keep a family safe. But tonight, the chill seeping into Eleanor's bones had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the window panes. It was a coldness that bloomed from within, a mother's intuition sounding a silent, frantic alarm. For the past 3 weeks, an unnatural tension had settled over the house, thick and suffocating. Her son, David, had been acting like a ghost haunting his own life. He would return from his IT job late, his eyes hollow, his words clipped, avoiding her gaze, and, more painfully, avoiding the bright, hopeful eyes of his 13-year-old son, Leo. A sharp metallic rasp broke the silence of the night. It was the distinct sound of a heavy zipper being pulled shut. Eleanor threw back the heavy quilt, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. At 67, her joints ached with the changing weather, but she moved with a quiet urgency down the dimly lit hallway. The light from David's bedroom spilled out from beneath his door, slicing a yellow line across the Persian runner. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open. David stood at the foot of his unmade bed, violently shoving a stack of folded sweaters into a large black duffel bag. His movements were jerky, frantic, lacking any of the meticulous organization he usually applied to his life. The room, usually kept in sterile, almost obsessive order, was a disaster. Drawers were yanked open, hangers lay discarded on the floor, and a framed photograph of his late wife, Leo's mother, lay face down on the nightstand. "David?" Eleanor's voice was a whisper, but in the quiet of the night, it sounded like a shout. He froze, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his shirt, but he didn't turn around. He simply kept his back to her, his hands gripping the edges of the duffel bag so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What are you doing?" she asked, stepping fully into the room. The air in here felt thin, hard to breathe. "It's 2 in the morning. Are you going on a business trip? You didn't mention anything at dinner." "It's not a business trip, Mom," David said. His voice was flat, devoid of the familiar warmth that used to fill this house. It was the voice of a stranger. He finally turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made Eleanor's stomach drop. There was no guilt, no hesitation, no sorrow. There was only a terrifying, empty resolve. "Then where are you going?" she pressed, taking a step toward him, her maternal instinct desperate to bridge the sudden, massive chasm that had opened between them. "David, you're scaring me. What is going on?" He zipped the bag with a vicious yank, the sound echoing off the bare walls. He hoisted the heavy bag onto his shoulder, adjusting the strap with calculated efficiency. "I'm leaving." The 2 words hung in the air, heavy and blunt as a lead weight. "Leaving?" Eleanor echoed, her mind struggling to process the concept. "Leaving for where? For how long? David, you have work in the morning. Leo has his midterm in history tomorrow. You promised you would drive him." "I'm not coming back, Mom." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She reached out, her trembling hand catching the sleeve of his jacket. "You're not making sense. People don't just pack a bag in the middle of the night and never come back. Did something happen at work? Are you in some kind of trouble? Whatever it is, we can fix it. We are a family. We always fix things together." David looked down at her hand on his arm, his expression twisting into something that looked uncomfortably close to disgust. He pulled his arm away, taking a deliberate step back. "There is nothing to fix because nothing is broken. I'm just done. I'm done with this house, I'm done with this town, and I'm done playing the tragic, grieving widower for a family that expects me to just suffer in silence." "Suffer?" Eleanor gasped, the injustice of the word stinging her like a physical blow. "David, when Sarah died, this entire house stopped turning to take care of you. I stepped in. I raised Leo so you could grieve, so you could focus on your career, so you could heal. Nobody asked you to suffer. We only asked you to live." "Well, now I'm going to," he sneered, grabbing a smaller leather satchel from his desk. "I have a chance at a real life, a new start, and I'm taking it." "A new start?" Eleanor's eyes darted toward the hallway, toward the closed door of her grandson's room. "And what about Leo? You're a father, David. You can't just walk out on your 13-year-old son. He needs you. He idolizes you. For a fraction of a second, a shadow crossed David's face, a microscopic flicker of the boy she had raised. But it was extinguished just as quickly, replaced by that chilling, impenetrable coldness. He doesn't need me. Let's be honest, Mom. He hasn't needed me in years. You're the one who raised him. You're more of a mother to him than a grandmother. He's better off with you anyway. You always did like being in control. The cruelty of his words stole the breath from Eleanor's lungs. She stared at the man standing before her, a man whose scraped knees she had bandaged, whose college tuition she had paid for with years of double shifts, whose child she had rocked to sleep when he was too paralyzed by grief to function. He wasn't her son anymore. He was a hollow shell, evacuated of every moral and emotional foundation she had spent a lifetime building within him. "You can't do this," she whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes, blurring his outline. "You cannot abandon your child. It will break him." "He's resilient, like you," David said, stepping around her toward the door. "You'll figure it out. You always do." Eleanor turned, following him into the hallway. "Who is she, David?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. A mother knows. A man doesn't burn his entire life to the ground in the middle of the night for a fresh start, unless there is a catalyst. David stopped at the top of the stairs. He didn't look back. "Her name doesn't matter. Just know that I'm finally happy." He began his descent, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden steps. Each footfall felt like a nail being driven into Eleanor's heart. She stood at the top of the landing, paralyzed by a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She watched him walk to the front door, turn the deadbolt, and step out into the freezing October night. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the sound agonizingly final. A moment later, the low rumble of his car engine started in the driveway. Tires crunched over gravel, fading slowly down the street, until there was nothing left but the oppressive, deafening silence of the old house. Eleanor stood frozen for a long time, her hand gripping the mahogany banister so tightly her joints ached. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a massive crater, the ground having simply vanished beneath her feet. When she finally found the strength to move, she didn't go back to her room. She walked quietly to the end of the hall and slowly pushed open Leo's door. The room was bathed in the soft blue glow of a digital alarm clock. Leo was asleep, his breathing deep and even, one arm thrown casually over his pillow. He looked so young, so entirely unguarded. Eleanor approached his bed, sinking into the chair beside it. She watched the gentle rise and fall of his chest, a fresh wave of tears spilling hot and fast down her weathered cheeks. "How do I tell him?" she thought, her heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "How do I tell this beautiful, innocent boy that his father looked at him, looked at his whole life, and decided it wasn't worth staying for?" She sat there until the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the window blinds, standing vigil over a childhood that had just abruptly, violently ended. The next 3 days were a masterclass in pretending. Eleanor moved through the routines of life like a tightly wound clockwork doll. She cooked breakfast, packed Leo's lunches, asked about his history midterm, and smiled when he talked about his science fair project. She told Leo that his father had been called away on an emergency, open-ended IT contract in another state. It was a lie, brittle and fragile, but Leo, used to his father's emotional distance and erratic work schedule, accepted it with a quiet nod. But beneath the facade of normalcy, Eleanor was drowning. The house, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a mausoleum. David's empty bedroom radiated a cold, silent, mocking energy. She couldn't bring herself to go inside, couldn't bear to see the empty closet or the framed photo of Sarah still lying face down on the nightstand. She spent her nights pacing the living room, staring out the window into the dark street, waiting for a car that would never return, waiting for a phone call that would never come. She was angry. She was terrified. But mostly she was consumed by a deep, hollow grief. She had lost her husband to cancer, a painful but natural tragedy. Losing a child to his own selfish cruelty was an entirely different kind of death. It was a death of hope. On the evening of the 4th day, the weather took a drastic turn. A bitter Arctic front swept down from the north, plunging the town into an unseasonable, biting freeze. The wind howled against the Victorians' thick windows, rattling the glass in their frames. Eleanor was in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes, when she noticed the air growing uncomfortably cold. She dried her hands and walked to the hallway thermostat. It was set to 70 degrees, but the digital display read 58. She placed her hand over the nearest floor register. Nothing. No familiar rush of warm air. A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She grabbed a flashlight from the utility drawer and made her way down the creaking wooden stairs into the basement. The air down here was damp and frigid. She aimed the beam of light at the massive ancient boiler that Thomas had always managed to coax into working every winter. The pilot light was completely out, and a small pool of dark, oily water had gathered at the base of the machine. Eleanor sighed, a puff of white condensation appearing in the freezing air. She didn't know the first thing about boilers. That had always been Thomas's domain, and later, David's. Now she was alone in a freezing house with a 13-year-old boy asleep upstairs. She climbed back upstairs, wrapping herself in a thick wool cardigan. It was too late to call a repair service tonight, and she didn't want to wake Leo. She retrieved extra blankets from the hall closet, quietly sneaking into Leo's room to drape them over his sleeping form. She then retreated to her own bed, shivering beneath a mountain of quilts, praying the pipes wouldn't freeze before morning. By sunrise, the house was an icebox. The temperature inside had plummeted to 48 degrees. Eleanor woke up with a stiff neck and a deep, aching cold in her joints. She quickly made a pot of hot tea, her breath visible in the kitchen air, and woke Leo, instructing him to dress in layers. "Is the heat broken, Grandma?" Leo asked, walking into the kitchen wearing a thick sweater and a beanie, rubbing his arms. "Just a little hiccup with the boiler, sweetheart," Eleanor lied smoothly, pouring him a steaming mug of tea. "I'm going to call the repairman as soon as they open. You just focus on getting to school and staying warm." After seeing Leo off to the school bus, Eleanor pulled out the yellow pages and called the local HVAC company. The repairman arrived 2 hours later. He spent 45 minutes in the basement, accompanied by the sounds of clanking metal and low curses. When he finally emerged, his hands were wiped black with grease, and his expression was grim. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, wiping his brow with a rag. "The heat exchanger is completely cracked, and the main valve is shot. This unit is older than I am. We can't even get parts for it anymore. It's a total loss. You're going to need a full replacement." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. "A replacement? The entire unit?" "Yes, ma'am. Boiler, new piping for the basement connections, labor, to get it up to current safety codes." He pulled a small notepad from his pocket and scribbled some numbers. "You're looking at around $8,000, maybe $8,500. The number hit Eleanor like a physical punch. $8,000. It was an astronomical sum for a retired high school teacher living on a fixed pension. But she had no choice. She couldn't let Leo freeze. "All right," Eleanor said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She was Eleanor Vance. She survived. She planned. "I have the funds. How soon can you install it? We're freezing in here." "I can have a crew out here first thing tomorrow morning, Mrs. Vance, but my company requires a 50% deposit up front for emergency installations, especially for hardware this expensive." "I understand," Eleanor nodded. "I'll go to the bank right now and arrange a cashier's check. Can you start drafting the paperwork?" "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor retreated to her bedroom, pulling on her heavy winter coat, a thick scarf, and her leather gloves. She unlocked her mahogany dresser and pulled out her checkbook and her identification. As she looked at the neat leather ledger, she felt a small wave of gratitude for her own financial discipline. Over her 35 years of teaching history at the local high school, Eleanor had never been a wealthy woman, but she and Thomas had been fiercely frugal. They had paid off the mortgage on the Victorian early. They had lived below their means. And every single month, without fail, Eleanor had deposited a portion of her paycheck into her savings account. It was her emergency fund, her safety net against a world she knew could be unpredictable and cruel. Over the decades, through the power of compound interest and relentless saving, that account had grown to just over $65,000. It was the money meant to support her through her twilight years. It was the money meant to ensure she would never be a burden to her family. And then there was Leo's account. When Sarah died, Eleanor had taken a significant portion of Thomas's life insurance policy and opened an educational trust account for Leo. Every birthday, every Christmas, she added to it. The account, meant to guarantee Leo a university education without the crushing weight of student debt, currently sat at an impressive $43,000. David was a joint signer on both accounts, a decision made years ago, out of trust, out of the practical need for him to manage things if her health ever failed. Eleanor grabbed her purse and walked out into the freezing morning. The drive to the local branch of First Fidelity Bank took less than 15 minutes. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, where the bank tellers asked about your grandchildren and remembered your preferred denomination of bills. The heavy glass doors of the bank slid open and a rush of glorious heated air enveloped her. Eleanor unbuttoned her coat, her boots clicking softly against the polished marble floor. The bank was quiet, with only a few elderly patrons filling out deposit slips at the high wooden tables. She walked up to the available teller, a sweet-faced young woman named Brenda, who had been a student in Eleanor's AP history class nearly 10 years ago. "Mrs. Vance, good morning." Brenda smiled brightly, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. "It's freezing out there today, isn't it? How are you doing? How's Leo?" "Good morning. Brenda, we're surviving the cold barely." Eleanor offered a polite, strained smile. "Unfortunately, our ancient boiler finally gave up the ghost last night. I need to get a cashier's check cut for the repair company. A deposit for a new unit." "Oh no, that's terrible timing with this freeze," Brenda said sympathetically, reaching for a withdrawal slip. "I can certainly help you with that. Which account would you like to draw the funds from?" "From my primary savings, please," Eleanor said, sliding her driver's license and debit card across the counter. "I need a cashier's check for $4,250, made out to Springfield Heating and Cooling." "You got it, Mrs. Vance. Let me just pull up your profile here." Brenda swiped the card and typed a few keys on her terminal. She hummed a quiet tune as she waited for the screen to load. Eleanor stood patiently, her eyes wandering to the large digital clock on the wall. She mentally calculated the remaining balance in her head. 65,000 minus 4,000. She would still have over 60,000 left. Plenty of cushion. She would need to tighten her budget this year, perhaps skip the small summer vacation she had planned with Leo, but they would be fine. They were safe. Behind the counter, Brenda's humming abruptly stopped. Eleanor looked back at the teller. Brenda was leaning closer to her monitor, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She hit a few keys, the clacking sound unnaturally loud in the quiet bank. She hit the refresh button. Then she hit it again. "Brenda?" Eleanor asked, a cold prickle of unease touching the back of her neck. "Is everything all right? Did I give you the wrong card?" "No, Mrs. Vance, it's the right card," Brenda murmured, her voice sounding strange, thin and nervous. She looked up, her eyes wide and avoiding Eleanor's direct gaze. I think our system might be glitching. Let me just try running the account number manually." Brenda's fingers flew across the number pad. She hit enter. She stared at the screen, the color completely drained from the young woman's face. "Brenda, what is it?" Eleanor demanded, her voice losing its polite teacher's cadence and adopting an edge of sharp authority. The unease in her chest was blossoming into full-blown panic. "Is there a problem with the check?" "Mrs. Vance," Brenda stammered, swallowing hard. Her hands were visibly shaking as she pulled them away from the keyboard. I can't issue a cashier's check for $4,000. "Why not?" Eleanor leaned against the high counter, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "Did the bank freeze the account for some reason? Was there a suspicious charge?" "No, the account isn't frozen," Brenda whispered, looking around as if seeking help from the empty lobby. "Mrs. Vance, I'm going to get Mr. Henderson, the branch manager. Just wait right here, please." Before Eleanor could protest, Brenda practically fled from her station, disappearing behind a frosted glass door at the back of the teller line. Eleanor stood entirely alone at the counter. The ambient noise of the bank, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the quiet chatter of other customers, the rustle of paper, seemed to fade away, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She gripped the edge of the marble counter, the cold stone biting into her palms. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Minutes stretched into eternity. Finally, the frosted glass door opened. Mr. Henderson, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a perpetually tired expression, walked out, followed closely by a pale, trembling Brenda. Mr. Henderson carried a sheaf of printed papers in his hand. He did not look happy. He looked devastated. "Eleanor, Mr. Henderson said softly as he approached the counter, dropping the formal Mrs. Vance they usually used. He placed the papers face down on the marble. "Why don't you come back to my office? Please." "I don't want to go to your office, Robert," Eleanor said, her voice shaking violently now. The polite facade was entirely gone. "I want to know why I can't access my money to keep my grandson from freezing to death in his own home." "What is going on?" "Mister?" Henderson closed his eyes for a brief second, taking a deep, ragged breath. He looked at her with a profound, aching pity that made Eleanor want to scream. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is no glitch in the system. I checked the logs myself." He slowly turned the stack of printed papers over, sliding them across the counter toward her. They were bank statements. The top page had her name printed in bold black ink. Eleanor Vance, Primary Savings. Eleanor looked down. Her eyes struggled to focus on the numbers. She scanned the column looking for the familiar 65,000. It wasn't there. Her eyes darted to the bottom of the page, to the bolded box labeled Current Available Balance. The number printed there made no sense. It was a typographical error. It had to be. $12.43, Eleanor stared at the number. $12.43. "This is wrong," Eleanor breathed, her lungs refusing to expand. She pushed the paper back toward the manager. "This is a mistake. I have over $60,000 in this account. I have been depositing money here since 1985. Check it again. Check it right now." "Eleanor, look at the transaction history," Mr. Henderson said gently, pointing a trembling finger at the center of the page. "Look at the dates." Eleanor forced her eyes upward. The page was filled with line after line of withdrawals. October 2nd, electronic transfer, outbound, $15,000. October 8th, electronic transfer, outbound, $20,000. October 14th, electronic transfer, outbound, $25,000. October 19th, wire transfer, outbound, $5,300. "I didn't make these transfers," Eleanor said, her voice rising in panic. "Someone hacked my account. Someone stole my identity. Robert, you have to stop these transfers. Reverse them." "We can't reverse them, Eleanor," Mr. Henderson said, his voice breaking. "They weren't hacked. They were authorized transfers, initiated via mobile banking, using correct passwords and two-factor authentication." "Authorized by who?" Eleanor shouted, her composure shattering. The few patrons in the bank turned to stare. Mr. Henderson reached over and flipped to the second page of the stack. It was a different account. The header read, Leo Vance, Educational Trust. Joint custodians, Eleanor Vance, David Vance. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. The ringing in her ears grew deafening. She looked down at the balance of her grandson's college fund. $0. "The transfers," Mr. Henderson said softly, his words landing like heavy stones in the silent bank, "were all routed to a new external checking account opened 3 weeks ago at a different institution." He paused, looking her directly in the eye, delivering the final fatal blow. "The external account is registered under the name David Vance." The world tilted violently on its axis. The marble counter beneath her hands seemed to dissolve. The bright lights of the bank flickered out, leaving her in a sudden, suffocating darkness. "I'm leaving. I have a chance at a real life. A new start." David's voice echoed in her mind, no longer just cold, but vibrating with a monstrous, calculated malice. He hadn't just abandoned them in the middle of the night. He had spent weeks, months, perhaps, systematically draining the lifeblood of their family. He had stolen her safety, her decades of hard work, her independence. But far worse, infinitely worse. He had stolen his own son's future. Eleanor Vance gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles stark white, her chest heaving as she fought for air. The freezing cold of her broken house was nothing compared to the absolute, terrifying winter that had just descended upon her soul. The drive back to the Victorian felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating dream. Eleanor didn't remember starting the car, nor did she remember obeying the traffic lights. Her hands, gripped tightly around the steering wheel, were completely numb, though whether from the biting cold or the sheer shock of the bank manager's revelation, she couldn't tell. When she pulled into her frozen driveway, the bright yellow van of Springfield Heating and Cooling was already idling by the curb. 2 men in heavy canvas jackets were unloading toolboxes from the back. Eleanor killed the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment. She closed her eyes, gathering the shattered fragments of her dignity. She was a woman who had never bounced a check, who had never missed a mortgage payment, who had spent decades teaching young people the value of responsibility and foresight. Now she had to step out of her car and humiliate herself. She walked up to the foreman, a burly man who offered a friendly nod. "Morning, Mrs. Vance. We're ready to get that old dinosaur out of your basement and get some heat back into this house. You got the deposit ready?" Eleanor swallowed the sharp, jagged stone in her throat. "I am so sorry, gentlemen," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent trembling in her hands. "There has been a sudden complication with my bank, a security hold. I won't be able to provide the cashier's check today." The foreman's smile faltered. "A hold? Ma'am, we pulled this unit from the warehouse for you. My guys are already on the clock." "I understand, and I apologize for wasting your time," Eleanor said, lifting her chin. She would not cry in front of these strangers. "But I cannot authorize the work right now. Please, send me an invoice for your travel time this morning. I will make sure it is paid." The men exchanged a look of annoyed resignation, packed up their tools, and drove away. Eleanor stood on the icy sidewalk, watching the yellow van disappear around the corner, taking the promise of warmth with it. She turned and looked up at her beautiful, historic home. It looked different now. It didn't look like a sanctuary anymore. It looked like a tomb. Inside, the temperature had dropped to 45 degrees. Eleanor didn't take off her coat. She walked into the kitchen, sat at the small wooden table, and stared at the frost forming on the window panes. For the first time in her 67 years, Eleanor Vance had absolutely no idea what to do. She had $12 to her name. Her son was a monster. Her grandson's future was gone. She put her face in her hands and let the heavy, silent sobs consume her. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the front door rattled open. "Grandma, I'm home!" Leo's voice echoed down the hallway, accompanied by the heavy thud of his backpack hitting the floor. "I totally aced the history midterm, mister. Peterson even asked to keep my essay as an example for the other classes." Eleanor quickly wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She walked out of the kitchen, pasting on a smile that felt like cracking glass. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I knew you would." Leo stopped in his tracks, his bright, intelligent eyes narrowing. He looked at her heavy coat, the red rimming her eyes, and the visible puff of his own breath in the freezing air. He didn't see the repairman. He didn't feel any heat. "Grandma," Leo said, dropping his tone. The childish excitement vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp maturity that broke Eleanor's heart all over again. "What happened? Where are the heater guys? They couldn't fix it today, Leo," Eleanor deflected, turning away to avoid his piercing gaze. "They need a special part. It might take a few days. We'll just have to layer up." Leo didn't push. He was a quiet observer, a trait he had inherited from his grandfather. He knew when Eleanor was lying, and he knew that whatever the truth was, it was bad enough to make his fierce, unshakable grandmother cry. "Okay," Leo said simply. He picked up his backpack. "I'm going to go do some homework." Instead of going up to his freezing bedroom, Leo walked into the small downstairs den. It was a room that had largely been abandoned since his father moved out of it to take the master bedroom upstairs. In the corner sat the old family desktop computer, a bulky, obsolete machine that David used to use before he bought his sleek, expensive work laptop. Leo sat down at the desk and pressed the power button. The old tower whirred to life, sounding like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. He waited patiently for the operating system to load. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew his dad. David was a tech guy by trade, but at home, he was incredibly lazy about his digital hygiene. He hated typing out long passwords, and he hated logging out of shared devices. The login screen appeared. There were two profiles, Eleanor and David _admin. Leo clicked on his father's profile. A password prompt popped up. Leo thought for a moment. He typed in Sarah 1988, his mother's name and birth year. Incorrect password. Leo frowned. He tried Sarah 1988. Incorrect password. He drummed his fingers on the desk. What else? His dad had changed lately. He didn't talk about Leo's mom anymore. He didn't look at her pictures. Leo thought about the strange, detached way his father had been acting for the past month. He typed, New Start 2026. The screen froze for a second, then the desktop bloomed to life. Leo felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The password itself felt like a betrayal. He opened the web browser. As he suspected, it opened directly to his father's personal webmail account, automatically logging him in because David had checked the Keep Me Signed In box months ago and never bothered to clear the cookies. Leo wasn't a hacker. He didn't know how to write code or bypass firewalls. But he was a 13-year-old boy who had grown up on the internet, and he knew how to use a search bar. He clicked on the search icon within the inbox and typed the word bank. Dozens of emails populated the screen. Leo clicked on the most recent one, dated just 2 days ago. It wasn't from a bank. It was from an email address he didn't recognize. c.sterling.invest@protonmail.com. Leo read the text, his eyes widening with every line. David, the final wire cleared this morning. The old lady's primary accounts are effectively drained. Excellent work navigating the two-factor authentication on her phone while she was asleep. The offshore routing is set up. Pack your bags. Phase 3 starts tomorrow. Chloe. Leo felt physically sick. The old lady, his grandmother. His dad had stolen from her while she was sleeping in the very next room. He quickly hit print on the keyboard, the old inkjet printer in the corner groaning as it slowly spit out the page. He didn't stop there. He searched the name Chloe. Hundreds of messages appeared, stretching back nearly 6 months. He opened another one, this one with an attachment labeled Leo_trust_transfer.pdf. David attached is the confirmation for the boys' educational fund. I've diverted it through the Shell LLC as discussed. They won't be able to trace it once it hits the Cayman account. You're doing the right thing. He doesn't need that money anyway. He's smart, he'll get a scholarship. You deserve this payout after everything you've sacrificed. Leo's hands shook as he printed that page too. His own father, his college fund, everything his grandmother had saved for him, erased with a few keystrokes and justified by a woman named Chloe. 10 minutes later, Leo walked quietly into the living room. Eleanor was sitting on the sofa, wrapped in 3 blankets, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace. "Grandma?" Leo's voice was small, trembling slightly. Eleanor turned her head. "Yes, dear?" Leo walked over and placed a small stack of freshly printed papers on her lap. "I know why the heater guys didn't fix the boiler. I know why Dad left." Eleanor looked down at the papers. She saw the email addresses. She saw the words drained, offshore, and the old lady. As she read the documents, the color completely drained from her face. She didn't cry this time. The profound, paralyzing grief was suddenly incinerated by something entirely different, a blinding, white-hot fury. "Leo," Eleanor whispered, her voice dangerously calm. "Where did you get these?" "Dad's old computer in the den. He didn't log out. Grandma? He took everything. He took my college money." Eleanor reached out, pulling Leo into a fierce, desperate hug. She pressed his face into her shoulder, her hand resting protectively on the back of his head. "I am so sorry, Leo. I am so, so sorry." "What are we going to do?" Leo mumbled against her coat. "Do we call the police?" Eleanor pulled back, looking at the papers again. The police. The thought of sitting in a sterile precinct, explaining that her own flesh and blood had robbed her blind, made her stomach churn. The police would take a report. They would assign a detective. It would take weeks, maybe months, just to get subpoenas for bank records. By then, David and this Chloe person would be ghosts, taking her life savings with them. "No," Eleanor said, her jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. "Not yet. The police handle street criminals, Leo. What your father did. This is financial warfare. We need someone who speaks their language." She stood up, letting the blankets fall to the floor. She walked to the hallway telephone, her fingers dialing a number she had known by heart for 30 years. It rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Hughes." "Arthur," Eleanor said. "It's Eleanor Vance." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a warm chuckle. "Ellie, my goodness, it's been far too long. How are you? How's that grandson of yours growing?" "Arthur, I need your help," Eleanor cut in, her voice stripping away any pleasantries. "I need you to come to the house right now. Bring your laptop. And Arthur, please bring a space heater." Arthur Hughes was not a man who asked unnecessary questions. Within 45 minutes, a heavy black SUV crunched into Eleanor's driveway. Arthur stepped out, a towering man of 68 with a thick mane of silver hair, wearing a sharp tweed blazer over a wool turtleneck. He carried a heavy-duty ceramic space heater in one hand and a battered leather briefcase in the other. Arthur had been Thomas's best friend since college. He had also spent 35 years as a senior forensic accountant for the IRS, tracking down hidden assets for federal prosecutors. If money moved anywhere in the world, Arthur Hughes could find the footprints. He walked into the freezing house, took one look at Eleanor's grim face and Leo's pale, frightened expression, and immediately went to work. He plugged the heater into the living room wall, creating a small oasis of warmth, and set his laptop on the coffee table. "All right, Ellie," Arthur said gently, taking a seat opposite her. "Talk to me. Who died or who stole what?" Eleanor handed him the printed emails Leo had found. "David left in the middle of the night. This morning I found out my savings and Leo's trust fund are completely gone. Over $100,000, Arthur. Leo found these on David's old computer." Arthur's bushy eyebrows shot up. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and began scanning the printed pages. The room was dead silent, save for the hum of the space heater and the occasional sharp intake of breath from Arthur as he processed the financial terminology. "Offshore routing, Shell LLCs, Cayman accounts," Arthur muttered, his eyes narrowing. He looked up at Eleanor, his expression entirely transformed. The warm, grandfatherly friend was gone. The forensic hound had caught a scent. "Eleanor, your son is an IT guy. He fixes servers for local law firms. He doesn't know how to set up an untraceable Cayman shell corporation." "That's what I thought," Eleanor said. "He had to have help." Arthur tapped a thick finger against the name on the email printout. Chloe Sterling. "This woman. Have you ever met her? Did David ever mention her?" "Never," Eleanor replied. "He just said he was leaving for a fresh start. He never gave a name." Arthur opened his laptop, his thick fingers flying across the keyboard with surprising speed. "Let's see who Miss Sterling is." He logged into a proprietary database, a perk of his long career and maintained connections, and began running searches. He cross-referenced the Proton mail address, the name, and the specific routing numbers mentioned in the emails. 10 minutes passed. The only sound was the clicking of keys. Finally, Arthur stopped typing. He stared at his screen, his jaw tight. "Well?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward. "Who is she?" Arthur turned the laptop around so Eleanor and Leo could see the screen. It displayed what looked like a dossier. There was a mugshot of an attractive woman in her early 30s, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. "Her real name is Chloe Sterling, but she's operated under half a dozen aliases," Arthur said, his voice grim. "She is not a casual girlfriend, Ellie. She's a professional, a predator." "A predator?" Leo asked, his eyes wide. "She's a convicted fraudster," Arthur explained, pointing to the screen. "Served 3 years in a minimum security federal facility in Nevada for wire fraud. Her M.O. is highly specific. She targets recently widowed or emotionally vulnerable men who have access to significant family assets. She romances them, isolates them, convinces them to invest those assets into fake offshore portfolios, and then she vanishes." Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her, chilling her deeper than the ambient temperature of the room. "She targeted David? Because of Thomas's life insurance? Because of my savings?" "Exactly," Arthur nodded heavily. "She likely found him on a grief support forum or a dating app, identified him as an easy mark, and reeled him in. She's the architect of this entire extraction." "So Dad was brainwashed?" Leo asked, a desperate note of hope creeping into his voice. "He didn't mean to do it? She tricked him?" Arthur looked at the young boy, his expression softening with immense pity. He reached out and gently laid a hand on Leo's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son," Arthur said softly. "But look at the emails you found. She didn't trick him into giving her the money. She instructed him on how to steal it from you. He bypassed your grandmother's security. He authorized the transfers. She may have built the gun, Leo, but your father is the one who pulled the trigger." Eleanor closed her eyes, the brutal reality settling over her shoulders like a lead mantle. David wasn't just a victim of a scam. He was an active, willing accomplice in the destruction of his own family. "They think they've won," Arthur said, his voice hardening as he closed the laptop with a sharp snap. "They think because the money is offshore, and because David is family, you won't fight back. They think you'll just roll over and take it." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, protective fire. "Are you going to roll over, Ellie?" Eleanor Vance looked at the small ceramic heater, feeling the faint, stubborn warmth it produced against the overwhelming cold. She looked at her grandson, a brilliant, brave boy who had lost his mother to fate and his father to greed. Then she looked at Arthur. The despair that had paralyzed her all morning evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline resolve. "No, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice like cracking ice. "I am going to hunt them down, and I am going to take back exactly what belongs to us." The living room of the old Victorian house transformed overnight from a freezing, grief-stricken parlor into a war room. Arthur Hughes had commandeered the large oak dining table, spreading out printed ledgers, tax documents, and a maze of digital routing numbers. He worked with the relentless, methodical intensity of a man who had spent 3 decades unspooling the financial lies of cartels and corporate embezzlers. Beside him sat 13-year-old Leo, a heavy blanket draped over his small shoulders. Leo proved to be an invaluable asset. While Arthur understood the complex architecture of international banking, Leo understood the chaotic, messy digital habits of his father. When Arthur needed to know what IP address David had used to authorize the transfers, Leo navigated the old desktop system logs to find it. When Arthur hit a dead end on Chloe's email encryption, Leo dug into the browser's cached memory to pull up auto-saved form data that David had foolishly left behind. Eleanor kept the coffee brewing and the space heater aimed squarely at the two of them. She watched her grandson, her heart aching with a mixture of profound sorrow and fierce pride. Leo shouldn't be spending his youth hunting down his own father's crimes. He should be worrying about history exams and baseball tryouts. Yet here he was, staring at a glaring screen at 3 a.m, his young face hardened by betrayal. "I've got it," Arthur suddenly grunted, his gravelly voice breaking the quiet hum of the room. He pushed his reading glasses up his forehead and rubbed his tired eyes. "I know where the money is." Eleanor rushed to the table, leaning over his shoulder. "Is it in the Caymans? Is it gone?" "Not yet," Arthur said, tapping a thick finger against a line of code on his screen. "People think wire transfers are instantaneous. They aren't, especially large international transfers involving educational trusts and flagged offshore havens. The money left your accounts here in Springfield, but it hasn't crossed international waters yet. It's currently sitting in a holding pattern at a correspondent bank in Delaware, waiting for final clearance through the Federal Reserve's wire system." "What does that mean for us?" Eleanor asked, her pulse quickening. "It means we have a window," Arthur said, turning to look at her, his expression deadly serious. "The wire clearinghouse opens at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The moment the clock strikes 9, that money moves out of U.S. jurisdiction. Once it hits the Caymans, it gets dispersed into half a dozen shell LLCs, and we will never see a dime of it again, not without a team of international lawyers and a decade of litigation." Leo looked up, his eyes wide. "What time is it now?" Eleanor glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. "It's 4:30 a.m. We have exactly 4.5 hours to stop that transfer," Arthur said, snapping his laptop shut. "Eleanor, go put on your warmest coat. We are going to be sitting in the parking lot of First Fidelity Bank the moment Mr. Henderson arrives for work." The sun had barely breached the horizon, casting a pale, freezing gray light over Springfield, when Eleanor's sedan pulled into the empty bank parking lot. They sat in the car with the engine running to keep the heater blasting. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, a thick manila folder resting on his lap. He had compiled every piece of evidence Leo had found. The emails from Chloe, the IP logs proving the transfers were initiated from David's laptop while Eleanor was asleep, and Chloe Sterling's federal criminal record. At 7:45 a.m., a silver sedan pulled into the designated manager's spot. Robert Henderson stepped out, clutching a briefcase, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Eleanor didn't wait. She threw open her car door and intercepted him before his key even touched the bank's glass door. "Eleanor?" Mr. Henderson jumped, startled. "What are you doing here? The branch doesn't open for another hour." "We aren't here to make a deposit, Robert," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the unmistakable, commanding tone of a high school teacher who was absolutely done repeating herself. She gestured to Arthur, who stepped out of the car, towering over the bank manager. "This is Arthur Hughes. He is a retired forensic accountant for the IRS and my personal financial representative. Open the door." Henderson looked from Eleanor's steely gaze to Arthur's intimidating bulk. Intimidated and flustered, he unlocked the door and led them through the dark, quiet lobby into his office. "Eleanor, I told you yesterday," Henderson stammered as he turned on the lights and took his seat behind his desk. "My hands are tied. David was a joint signer on those accounts. Legally, he had the right to move those funds. There is nothing the bank can do to reverse it." "He committed wire fraud, Mr. Henderson," Arthur said, stepping forward and dropping the heavy manila folder onto the manager's desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "He executed those transfers under the direct coercion and coordination of a convicted federal felon, Chloe Sterling. Her dossier is right there." Henderson cautiously opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. His face paled. "The funds are currently sitting in a correspondent transit account at Delaware Fidelity," Arthur continued, his voice low and dangerous. "They are scheduled to clear the Fed wire at 9 a.m. I need you to issue an immediate, emergency stop payment order and flag the routing number under the Bank Secrecy Act for suspected money laundering." I can't do that," Henderson said, sweating despite the chill in the building. "A stop payment on a cleared domestic transfer requires a court injunction. If I freeze funds that David Vance legally authorized, the bank opens itself up to a massive civil liability lawsuit from him. We need a police report, a judge's order." "There is no time for a judge, Robert." Eleanor slammed her gloved hands onto the desk, leaning over it. The sudden outburst made the manager flinch. "That is my life savings. That is my grandson's entire future. It is leaving the country in 50 minutes. "Eleanor, I am so sorry, but banking regulations—" "Do not quote regulations to me," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet rumble. "You want to talk about liability, Mr. Henderson? Let's talk about Regulation E. Let's talk about the bank's failure to flag a sudden, uncharacteristic liquidation of a senior citizen's life savings and a minor's trust fund to a newly opened out-of-state account. If that money leaves U.S. soil today, I am not going to sue David. I am going to bring the full weight of the Federal Banking Commission down on First Fidelity. I will personally ensure that your branch is investigated for aiding and abetting the financial exploitation of an elder. Do you want to be the manager who loses $60,000 to a known federal felon because you were too scared of paperwork?" "C-A-D-N." Henderson stared at Arthur, paralyzed. The clock on his wall ticked relentlessly. It was 8:17 a.m. "Robert," Eleanor said, her voice softening, weaponizing the decades she had known this man. "You know me. You knew Thomas. You know I am not a hysterical woman making unfounded accusations. My son has been compromised by a criminal. He is stealing his own child's future. I am begging you, as a father, as a member of this community, freeze that account." Henderson looked down at the mugshot of Chloe Sterling staring back at him from the folder. He looked at the clock. 8:20 a.m. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "If I do this," Henderson whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for his computer mouse, "I am putting my neck on the chopping block. The fraud department is going to scream." "Let them scream," Arthur said firmly. "I'll handle the fraud department. Just hit the button." Henderson typed frantically, his eyes darting between the routing numbers in Arthur's file and his banking terminal. The tension in the office was suffocating. Every click of the mouse felt like a hammer blow. Eleanor held her breath, her nails biting into the palms of her hands. "Accessing the correspondent ledger," Henderson muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Locating the outbound wire. Jesus, it was queued for the first batch at 9 a.m. "Stop it," Eleanor urged. "Initiating a Code 4 fraud injunction," Henderson said, his finger hovering over the mouse. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, closed his eyes, and clicked. A loading wheel spun on the screen. It felt like an eternity. 10 seconds. 20. Then a bright red banner flashed across the top of the monitor. "Injunction successful. Funds frozen pending investigation." Eleanor let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 days. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and she sank into the leather chair opposite the desk. Arthur let out a gruff sigh of relief, placing a heavy hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "It's done," Henderson said, leaning back in his chair, looking thoroughly exhausted. "The money is locked in Delaware. It can't move forward, and it can't come back without a full investigation. You have 48 hours to get me a formal police report and a judge's order to keep the freeze in place." "You'll have it by tomorrow morning," Arthur promised, scooping up his folder. "You did the right thing today, Mr. Henderson. Thank you." Eleanor couldn't speak. She just nodded at the manager, tears of pure relief pricking her eyes. They had done it. They had beaten the clock. The money wasn't safe yet, but it wasn't gone. The drive back to the house felt lighter. The freezing air outside didn't seem so biting anymore. They had struck a blow against the people who had tried to ruin them. When they walked through the front door, Leo was waiting in this hallway, wrapped in his blanket. "Did you get it?" Leo asked, searching his grandmother's face. Eleanor smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time in days. "We stopped it, sweetheart. The money is frozen." Leo let out a cheer, throwing his arms around Eleanor's waist. Arthur chuckled, heading toward the kitchen to pour himself a much-deserved cup of coffee. For a brief, shining moment, the old Victorian felt like a home again. They had fought back, and they had won. Then the shrill ring of the kitchen telephone shattered the peace. Eleanor froze. She looked at the caller ID display mounted on the wall. It read, "Unknown caller." Arthur stopped pouring his coffee. He looked at the phone, then at Eleanor. "Don't answer it." But Eleanor's intuition, the same sharp instinct that had woken her the night David left, flared to life. She knew exactly who was on the other end of that line. She walked slowly to the wall and picked up the receiver. "Hello? You stupid meddling old bitch!" The voice was David's, but it was entirely unrecognizable. It was stripped of all its usual passive-aggressive detachment. It was raw, vicious, and vibrating with a terrifying, unhinged rage. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "David?" Leo's head snapped up at his father's name. Arthur stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" David screamed through the receiver, the sound of traffic blaring in the background. "Chloe's broker just called. The Delaware Transit account is locked. They flagged the wire." "Yes, David, they did," Eleanor said, her voice remarkably steady, drawing strength from Arthur's presence. "Because you stole it. You tried to steal your own son's college fund." "It was my money, too. I was on the accounts," he roared. "You think you're so smart, don't you, Mom? Always controlling everything, always playing the martyr. Well, congratulations. You just signed your own death warrant. And Leo's." "Are you threatening us?" Eleanor demanded, her grip tightening on the plastic receiver. "Because Arthur Hughes is standing right here, and the FBI will have this recording." "I don't need to physically threaten you, you old fool." David laughed, a manic, desperate sound that chilled Eleanor to the bone. "You think the cash in the bank was all I took? You think Chloe and I spent 3 weeks planning this just to empty a savings account?" A sickening dread began to pool in Eleanor's stomach. "What are you talking about? Did you really think I didn't know your social security number, Mom? I filed your taxes for the last 5 years, David hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "And Leo's? I'm his father. I have his birth certificate in my glove compartment." Eleanor stopped breathing. The room began to spin. "David, what did you do?" "Chloe has friends, Mom. People who don't ask for credit checks. People who operate online, through shell companies and payday loan syndicates. Over the last 2 weeks, I took out $50,000 in unsecured personal loans." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, letting the poison seep in. $30,000 under your name and social security number, and $20,000 under Leo's. "He's 13 years old!" Eleanor screamed, her composure shattering completely. "He's a child. And now he's a child with 20 grand in defaulted high-interest debt," David snapped back. "Here is how this works, Mom. You are going to call your little friend at the bank right now. You are going to tell him you made a mistake, that you authorized the wire, and you are going to unfreeze that Delaware account. If that money isn't in the Caymans by tomorrow morning, I am going to take every single loan document, every forged signature, and I am going to let them default. The collection agencies will seize your house. Your credit will be destroyed. And Leo will never be able to get a student loan, buy a car, or rent an apartment for the rest of his life. I will ruin him." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. She looked at Leo, who was watching her with terrified, wide eyes, clutching his blanket. "You are a monster," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "No, Mom," David replied, his voice chillingly calm. "I'm just finally taking control. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to release the funds. Unfreeze the cash, or I burn your whole world to the ground." The line went dead, leaving only the dial tone echoing in Eleanor's ear like a siren. She slowly lowered the receiver, turning to face Arthur and Leo. The victory of the morning had been a complete illusion. David hadn't just stolen their past. By stealing their identities, he had shackled them to his crimes, holding their very futures hostage. They were trapped. The dial tone hummed in the freezing kitchen, a flat, mechanical drone that sounded like a flatlining heartbeat. Eleanor slowly placed the receiver back onto the wall hook. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to try 3 times before it caught. Arthur stood perfectly still, his heavy features carved in stone. Leo was huddled on the living room sofa, the heavy wool blanket pulled up to his chin, his dark eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. He had heard enough of the conversation. He knew what his father had done. "Ellie," Arthur started, his voice a low, careful rumble. "He took out loans," Eleanor whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. $50,000 in high-interest unsecured debt. He used my social security number. He used Leo's. She turned to Arthur, her composure finally, spectacularly shattering. "He used a 13-year-old boy's identity to borrow money from loan sharks, Arthur. If I don't unfreeze the Delaware account by tomorrow morning, he's going to let the debt default. They'll take the house. They'll destroy Leo's future before it even begins." Arthur cursed, a harsh, ugly sound that startled Leo. The forensic accountant ran a hand through his silver hair, pacing the length of the small kitchen. "It's a classic extortion pivot. When the primary theft is blocked, they weaponize your credit. He's betting that your maternal instinct will override your financial self-preservation." "And he's right," Eleanor said, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of despair washed over her. She sank into a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands. "I have to do it. I have to call Robert back and release the wire. I can live with losing my savings. I can sell this house and rent a small apartment. But I cannot let him ruin Leo. I won't let him put a financial noose around my grandson's neck." "Eleanor, listen to me," Arthur said, kneeling beside her chair so he was eye level with her. "If you unfreeze that money, it goes to the Caymans. David and this Chloe woman disappear with over $100,000 in untraceable cash. And what guarantee do you have that he'll actually pay off those fraudulent loans? None. He's a criminal, Ellie. He'll take your savings, leave the country, and let the debt default anyway. You'll lose the cash and the house." "Then what do I do, Arthur?" Eleanor cried out, the frustration and terror tearing at her throat. "Tell me what to do. Because right now, my son is holding a gun to my grandson's head, and I am entirely out of options." "We aren't out of options," a small, remarkably steady voice said from the doorway. Eleanor and Arthur turned. Leo stood there, having dropped the blanket. He looked freezing, his lips slightly pale in the unheated house, but his jaw was set with a determination that looked terrifyingly like Thomas Vance. "I'm not letting you give him your money, Grandma," Leo said, walking into the kitchen. "You worked your whole life for that. You saved it for us. He doesn't get to take it. Not for me. Not for anything." "Leo, sweetheart, you don't understand the legal implications of a defaulted—" Eleanor started, reaching out for him. "I understand that he's a coward," Leo interrupted, his young voice hardening into something sharp and brittle. "And I understand how he thinks. He always used to say that people who don't back up their data deserve to lose it. He was obsessed with cloud backups." Leo looked at Arthur. If Dad was helping this Chloe woman, he wouldn't just trust her. He's paranoid. He would have kept leverage. He would have backed up her files to his own drives, just in case she tried to screw him over. Arthur's eyes narrowed, the investigator in him instantly recognizing the logic. "You think he synced her work files to his personal cloud? The one connected to the desktop in the den?" "I know he did," Leo said, turning on his heel. "Because the storage drive on that old computer is almost full, and it wasn't last month. Come on." For the next 4 hours, the den became the epicenter of their desperate counterattack. While Arthur guided him on what file extensions and keywords to look for, Leo methodically bypassed his father's lazy directory protections. He didn't need to break into Chloe's secure servers. David had already done that for him. David, in his arrogant paranoia, had mirrored Chloe's entire digital workspace onto a hidden partition on the home desktop. At 2 p.m., Leo hit the mother lode. He opened a massive encrypted spreadsheet. The password prompt appeared. "Try the one he used for his email," Arthur suggested, leaning over the boy's shoulder. Leo typed Newstart 2026. The screen flashed green, and the spreadsheet populated. Arthur leaned in so close his nose almost touched the monitor. The spreadsheet was a master ledger, but it wasn't just David and Eleanor's names on the screen. There were columns of names, social security numbers, retirement account balances, and routing numbers. "My God," Arthur breathed, pulling his reading glasses down. His thick finger traced the screen. Margaret Higgins, age 78. Richard Bowles, age 82. Evelyn Carmichael, age 75. Eleanor stood behind them, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what she was looking at. "Who are these people, Arthur?" "Victims," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "This isn't a targeted family theft, Ellie. This is an industrial-scale syndicate." Chloe Sterling used her position as a financial advisor to gain access to the retirement accounts of elderly, isolated clients. "And look here." He pointed to a column labeled IT Override/falsified statements that had David's initials next to every single entry. "David built the back door," Leo said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He wrote the code that generated fake bank statements for these people, so when they logged in, they thought their money was still there, but it was actually being siphoned out." "Over $500,000 in total," Arthur calculated quickly, staring at the bottom line. He didn't just help her steal. He was her chief engineer. He built the infrastructure to rob 15 elderly people blind. Eleanor felt the room sway. The son she had raised, the boy she had taught to return extra change at the grocery store, had evolved into a predatory monster. He was destroying lives to fund his escape. "Grandma," Leo said quietly. He had opened another window on the screen. It was a synced messaging application. "I found their chats. You need to see this." Arthur stepped back, giving Eleanor room. She approached the glowing monitor with a profound sense of dread. The chat logs between David and Chloe spanned months. They discussed the logistics of the thefts, the offshore routing, the fake loans. But it was the casual, cruel banter between the logistics that finally broke the last remaining thread of Eleanor's maternal denial. She read a message from Chloe, dated 3 weeks ago. "The old lady's accounts are prepped. You sure you want to drain her dry? She won't be able to pay property taxes. She'll lose the Victorian." And then, David's response. Eleanor stared at the words her son had typed. "Let her lose it. She cares more about that rotting old house than she ever cared about me. She smothered me, Chloe. Always lecturing, always judging, always looking at me like I wasn't strong enough to handle Sarah's death. She took over my son, made me feel obsolete in my own home. Let her freeze in that house. Let her see what it's like to have the ground pulled out from under her. I want my cut, and I want her to suffer for it." The words weren't born of desperation or manipulation. They were born of a deep, festering, cowardly resentment. David hadn't stolen from her just because it was easy. He had stolen from her because he hated her for being strong when he was weak. It was a punishment. A profound, terrifying silence descended upon the den. Arthur looked at Eleanor, worried she might collapse. But Eleanor Vance did not collapse. She stood up very straight. The tears that had threatened to fall all day completely dried up. The grief, the panic, the agonizing heartbreak of a mother losing her child, all of it evaporated. In its place, a cold, diamond-hard armor settled over her soul. She was no longer a grieving mother. She was a matriarch whose family and community were under attack by a parasite, and she was going to eradicate it. "Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with a terrifying, absolute authority. "Do not call Robert. We are not unfreezing that account. Ellie, the loans—" "Forget the loans," Eleanor cut him off, her eyes blazing with an icy fire. "David made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was playing chess against a terrified old woman. He forgot that I taught history for 35 years. I know what happens to tyrants who overextend their supply lines." She pointed a commanding finger at the computer. "Leo, I need you to copy every single file, every chat log, every ledger on that hard drive onto multiple flash drives. Can you do that?" "Yes, Grandma," Leo said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard, his posture straightening as he fed off her sudden strength. "Arthur," Eleanor turned to her old friend, "I need you to draft an anonymous, legally bulletproof dossier. I want the IRS, the FBI Cybercrimes Division, and the State Banking Commission to have this evidence by midnight. But more importantly, I want you to find the contact information for the families of those 15 victims. We are going to send them the proof of where their parents' money went." Arthur, a slow, Dangerous smile spread across Arthur's weathered face. A scorched earth campaign. I like it. If we expose the syndicate, the federal government will freeze every asset tied to Chloe and David. They won't just lose the Delaware wire. They'll lose access to the fraudulent credit lines. The loans won't default because the feds will seize the initiating accounts. Exactly, Eleanor said. She walked over to the window, looking out at the freezing, darkening street. David gave me an ultimatum. Now I'm going to give him his new start. By 8 p.m., the trap was fully set and sprung. Arthur utilized encrypted drop boxes to deliver the massive cache of evidence to his former federal colleagues. He placed anonymous calls to the adult children of Margaret Higgins and Richard Bowles, explaining exactly what they would find in their email inboxes. Then they waited. The house was still freezing, the boiler still broken, but the cold didn't matter anymore. Eleanor sat in the wing-back chair in the living room, a thick quilt over her lap, a cup of hot tea in her steady hands. Arthur sat opposite her, his laptop open, monitoring the fallout through his network. Leo was safely tucked away upstairs, instructed to stay in his room and lock the door. At 11:45 p.m., Arthur's phone vibrated. He read a text message, his eyes lighting up. The FBI field office in Chicago just raided Chloe Sterling's fake brokerage firm, Arthur announced, his voice thick with satisfaction. Warrants have been issued. The State Banking Commission has locked down every Social Security number tied to David's IP address. The fraudulent loans are officially frozen under a federal cyber theft injunction. Your credit and Leo's are completely insulated. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea. And the Delaware wire? Seized by the Treasury Department, Arthur confirmed. It's going to take some paperwork, Ellie, but you and Leo will get your money back. All of it. Eleanor nodded once. It was a victory, complete and absolute. But the knot in her chest hadn't fully untied. There was one piece of the board left in play. They can't leave the country now, Eleanor said quietly. Their funds are frozen. Their passports will be flagged by morning. They are trapped. They'll run, Arthur predicted. They'll try to cross the border in a car, or they'll go to ground. No, Eleanor said, looking toward the heavy oak front door. David is a coward when a coward gets backed into a corner and his brilliant plan falls apart. He doesn't run into the unknown. He runs back to the only place he knows he can bully his way into safety. As if on cue, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness of the night. A dark sedan with its headlights turned off rolled into the driveway. Two figures emerged. Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice deadly calm. Call the police. Tell them we have intruders. Arthur pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and retreated into the shadows of the hallway, out of sight from the front door. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden porch stairs. A key rattled violently in the lock. David still had his house key. The heavy oak door swung open, letting in a blast of freezing night air. David Vance stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wild and bloodshot. Beside him stood Chloe Sterling. She didn't look like a glamorous financial advisor anymore. She looked frantic, her designer coat disheveled, her sharp features twisted in panic. "Mom!" David shouted, stepping into the dark living room. "Mom, where are you?" Eleanor reached over and clicked on the small brass reading lamp next to her chair. The sudden pool of light illuminated her sitting calmly, her hands folded over her quilt. "I am right here, David," she said. David rushed forward, stopping a few feet from her chair. He looked like a man standing on a crumbling cliff edge. "You didn't do it. The Delaware account is locked by the Treasury. My credit cards are declining. What did you do?" "I did exactly what I always do, David," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the large room. "I cleaned up your mess." Chloe stepped forward, pushing past David. Her eyes darted around the room like a cornered rat. "You stupid old woman, do you know who you're messing with? We are leaving tonight. David has half equity in this house. You are going to sign a quitclaim deed right now, transferring your half to him. We'll use the house as collateral for a hard money bail bondsman to get cash." She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a stack of legal papers, slamming them onto the coffee table. "Sign it, or I swear to God, we will take that boy upstairs and leave you with nothing." It was a bluff, a desperate, pathetic bluff from a woman who knew she was hours away from a federal prison cell. Eleanor didn't even look at the papers. She looked at Chloe, her gaze sweeping over the younger woman with an expression of absolute, devastating pity. You think you are the first parasite to try and feed off my family, Miss Sterling? Eleanor asked softly. You found a weak, grieving man and you manipulated him. You thought you were so clever. But you made a fatal error. You assumed that because I am old, I am helpless. You assumed that because I love my son, I would be blind to his true nature. Eleanor shifted her gaze to David. He was trembling, the bravado completely gone, replaced by the terrified little boy who used to hide in his closet during thunderstorms. David, Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. I read your messages. I read how much you hate me, how my strength made you feel small. David flinched as if she had struck him. Mom, I didn't. Save it, Eleanor commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. You wanted to see me with nothing. You wanted to see me freeze. Well, look around you. The house is freezing. The bank accounts are empty. But I am still standing here. And you? You are nothing but a common thief, begging for pennies in the ruins of the home you tried to destroy. Shut up, Chloe shrieked, lunging toward Eleanor, her hands raised. Just sign the damn papers. Before Chloe could take another step, a massive shadow detached itself from the hallway. Arthur Hughes stepped into the light, his sheer size and imposing presence stopping Chloe dead in her tracks. I wouldn't do that, Miss Sterling, Arthur rumbled, folding his arms across his chest. Assaulting a senior citizen carries a mandatory sentence enhancement in this state. Not that it matters, considering the 20 years you're looking at for federal wire fraud and elder abuse. David stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror as he recognized Arthur. Uncle Arthur? What are you doing here? I'm not your uncle, David, Arthur said with profound disgust. I am the man who just handed your entire digital footprint to the FBI. Red and blue lights suddenly exploded through the living room windows, painting the walls in frantic flashing colors. The wail of police sirens tore through the quiet neighborhood, not approaching, but arriving. Tires screeched to a halt on the street outside. Heavy boots pounded up the porch steps. Police, open the door, a voice boomed from outside. Chloe let out a strangled sob, dropping her bag. She spun around, looking for a back exit, but Arthur blocked the hallway. David didn't move. He simply collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, finally crushed by the weight of his own profound failures. Eleanor remained seated. She watched as the front door burst open and 4 armed police officers flooded the room. She watched them pull David's hands behind his back, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing like a final, definitive period at the end of a long, painful sentence. As they hauled David to his feet, he looked back at her. His eyes were streaming with tears, pleading for the mother who had always saved him. Mom, please. I'm sorry. Help me. Eleanor looked at the man who had tried to steal her grandson's future. She felt a profound, heavy sadness, but no regret. I did help you, David, Eleanor said softly, though the words carried over the chaos of the arrest. I finally stopped treating you like a child. Welcome to the real world. Welcome to the consequences. Six months later, the spring sun was shining brightly through the newly washed windows of the Victorian house. The air was warm, smelling of blooming lilac and fresh coffee. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug in her hand, watching the news on a small countertop television. The local anchor was delivering the morning headlines. Sentencing was handed down yesterday in the massive elder fraud syndicate case that rocked Springfield. Chloe Sterling received 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Her accomplice, local IT technician David Vance, who pleaded guilty and cooperated with authorities, was sentenced to 8 years in a medium-security facility. Eleanor reached over and clicked the television off. 8 years. It was a long time. But for the 15 families who had recovered their stolen life savings, and for the 13-year-old boy who had his future handed back to him, it was justice. The heavy, bureaucratic wheels of the Treasury Department had finally turned. The Delaware wire had been reversed. Eleanor's savings were fully restored, and Leo's trust fund was sitting safely in a newly secured account, overseen by both Eleanor and Arthur Hughes. The fraudulent loans had been expunged from their credit reports. The old boiler in the basement had been replaced with a state-of-the-art system that hummed quietly, keeping the house perfectly warm. Footsteps bounded down the stairs. Leo ran into the kitchen wearing his baseball uniform, his glove slung over his shoulder. He looked taller, his shoulders broader. The shadow that had haunted his eyes 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. He had faced down the darkest parts of the adult world and emerged victorious. "Morning, Grandma," Leo said, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "Arthur is outside in the truck. He said if I'm late for practice, he's making me run laps." Eleanor smiled, standing up to kiss his cheek. "Then you better hurry, sweetheart. Have a good practice. I'll have dinner ready when you get back." "Thanks, Grandma." Leo paused at the back door, looking back at her. "Hey, did the lawyer call about the visitation forms for the prison?" Eleanor's smile softened. "He did. The forms are here. You know you don't have to go, Leo. Nobody expects you to." Leo thought for a moment, tossing the apple lightly in his hand. "I know. I'm not ready yet. Maybe in a year, maybe longer. But I think I want to keep the option open. He's paying for what he did, but I don't want to carry around the hate forever. It's too heavy." Eleanor felt a swell of pride so immense it threatened to break her heart. Her grandson was stronger than his father could ever hope to be. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that forgiveness wasn't for the person who hurt you. It was the key that unlocked your own cage. "Take all the time you need, Leo," Eleanor said softly. "I'm right behind you, whatever you decide." Leo grinned, pushing the screen door open. "I know you are. See you later, Grandma." He ran out to the driveway, where Arthur gave the horn a quick, friendly honk. Eleanor watched the truck pull away, disappearing down the sunlit street. She turned back to the quiet, warm kitchen. The house was no longer a monument to a fractured family. It was a fortress. She walked over to the hallway, where the framed photograph of Sarah still sat on the small table. Beside it, she had placed a new photo, a picture of her, Leo, and Arthur, taken just last week at Leo's school science fair. Eleanor touched the frame lightly. True family wasn't defined by blood, she realized. Blood could betray you. Blood could abandon you in the middle of the night. True family was defined by who stayed when the house went cold. It was defined by who stood between you and the fire. And as Eleanor Vance looked around her warm, secure home, she knew with absolute certainty that her family was completely unbroken.